Welcome to a very, what I have no doubt will be a very, very special roundtable. It's a real honor for all of us at Chatham House to be able to welcome two such distinguished speakers. We're here really for three reasons. There are many reasons, but I thought about three as I was thinking about today's roundtable. One is, of course, that we're at a very profound moment in the history of America's engagement in the world. And so many of us are trying to understand whether this is a permanent change, and if it is, how Europe and the rest of the world should respond to it. The second reason, of course, is that we're 20 days out from an election that most of us, I think, fairly believe is the election of a generation. I think we're sitting on the edge of our seats, wondering which way it will go, afraid of believing the polls, and also wondering how long it will last. So I think it's an incredibly specific and timely moment. But the third reason, and the one that I'm especially excited about, is that we have two such distinguished speakers to share their remarks and their thinking on this question of US isolationism with us. The first is David Miliband, who of course is very well known to everybody in the UK. He is currently President and Chief Executive of the International Rescue Committee. He was a Labour MP from 2001 to 2013. He was the British Foreign Secretary from 2007 to 2010. And before that, Secretary of State for the Environment. Doesn't need an introduction, but we're very glad to have you, David. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We then have Charles Kupchan speaking with us. Charlie is also very well known to all of us at Chatham House. He is Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is a Professor of International Politics at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. He was Special Assistant to President Obama from 2014 to 2017, where he was also Senior Director on the National Security Council for European Affairs. And the occasion, of course, of this roundtable is the publication of his book, Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World. Charlie, you will know his writings. He's written many books. This one, I think, is incredibly timely and comes at a very important moment. Before I turn it over to our director, Robin Niblett, to say a few words, I just want to mention that tonight's roundtable, this afternoon's roundtable, for those of you joining us from Washington and New York, is jointly hosted by the London School of Economics, LSE Ideas, and also by the Imperial War Museum Institute. So that's also tremendously exciting for us to have new and different audiences. Thank you to all of you for joining us. We are on the record tonight, and we hope that you will ask your questions after we have a few remarks from Robin and then a conversation between Charlie and David. Robin, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Leslie. My role is simply to add to yours of saying warm words of welcome. Just great to have Charlie with us this evening at this time, and as you said, also to have David and the other great group of guests that you brought together, you and the US Americas program here at Chatham House. I mean, we're all, certainly here in the UK, consumed with US news and what's going on, but it's wonderful, Charlie, to have you with us to kind of take us back a little bit and shift the aperture and try to put all of this in its proper historical context. A little difficult right now when we're all in the weeds with you and your co-citizens in the US, but nonetheless incredibly important. And I suppose, I'm just going to give you the kickoff question to let you come up with some opening remarks and thoughts, and then Leslie will pick the thread up from there. The obvious question for me to ask, which I suppose is how you frame your book, is whether you believe that the Trump administration was just a quick hark back to old instincts of isolationism and America firstness that obviously we saw with a certain amount of prominence roughly 100 years ago from now, certainly 90 years ago from now, 85 years ago from now. And is it just a little blip, a sort of little bit of the old memory? I will even say here, the lizard brain coming out of isolationism right back to that original instinct of the founding of the United States, of getting away from the corrupt, messy Europe? Or, do you think this is, the US is heading back into a phase that is going to find itself difficult to escape from? That would be my broad opening question. That's what I think many of us here in the UK, but also around the world, are fascinated to know about. What are we? Is this just a moment, or is this something deeper? Over to you, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Rob. Leslie. Let me just say I'm indebted to you for hosting this, and thanks to David for joining in the conversation. My only regret is that we're not doing this in person. So I'm going to ask for a rain check once the pandemic lifts and make this happen so we can all get together again. Robin, let me make 3 points to get the conversation going, all of which will speak to your question, which is, where is this Trump America First thing coming from? Is it a bolt from the blue, or does it have deep roots in American history, American identity, and the American experience? And my first point is that, I started thinking about writing this book in the 1990s because I began to sense that the country was turning inward after the end of the Cold War. After the '94 midterms, Republicans and Democrats basically went in separate directions. The bipartisan foundations of liberal internationalism started to crack. Coverage of foreign affairs fell off a cliff in both print and broadcast journalism. That then sort of stops with 9/11. And everybody starts looking at the Middle East, extremism, terrorism. But then we get the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and there's a backlash. Again, a turn inward because of a reaction to the forever wars. And it was in that context that I started to say, you know what, I think I better go back and read American history to see what's going on here, whether I can find some lessons from the past for where the country may be heading in the future. And I started working on the book and reading about American grand strategy in the 19th and early 20th century. Then Trump gets elected. And to be quite honest, my head explodes because his isolationism, unilateralism, racism, protectionism, anti-immigrant sentiment, all of that is just a dominating mix of the fundamental characteristics of US grand strategy before Pearl Harbor. And so I'll start with just a quick overview, and that is that, basically from 1789 until Pearl Harbor, with a short exception during the Spanish-American War and then another one during World War I, Americans shunned foreign entanglement outside North America. And isolationism to me is the country willing to extend its strategic reach beyond the motherland? Now, yes, we were a commercial trading state from the very beginning. I don't see that as a counter to isolationism. Rather, the founders said, the fewer entanglements we have abroad, the more we will trade. And yes, the United States was fiercely expansionist here in North America, trampling on Native Americans, trying on several occasions to take over Canada, successfully grabbing a big chunk of Mexico's territory. So we were expansive here, but when we got to the Pacific coast, we stopped. And basically, the founders early on, right up until 1898, kept having discussions about going further. Santo Domingo, Latin America, Haiti, Cuba, Hawaii, points further, and always they swatted down such proposals. And then you have 1898 and World War I, but the US reacted against both of those efforts to embrace internationalism. And the reaction against the Spanish-American War and America's flirtation with imperialism, and then entry into World War I, was essentially to clear the way for the stubborn, dogged isolationism of the interwar era. And I basically try to tell a story that says, in some ways, the 19th century was isolationism's finest hour because it allowed the United States to rise in unmolested fashion. The interwar era was its darkest and most diluted hour because the United States ran for cover, a diluted search for strategic immunity, while fascism swept Europe and Asia. The second quick point that I'll make is where does this come from? I spend a lot of time in the book trying to unpack the ideological sources of isolationism. And I think in many respects, it all comes down to different versions of American exceptionalism. And that may sound a little bit odd to most of us, because for anyone who has come of age during the Cold War or in its aftermath, American exceptionalism is a justification for running the world. We need to go out there and we need to make sure that democracy and markets spread as widely as possible. Prior to 1941, American exceptionalism was the opposite. It was an ideological justification for keeping the world at bay, to protect the American experiment, to allow it to enjoy its natural security, its liberty, its freedom of action abroad, its separation from non-white populations. So there was a racist, a xenophobic element to isolationism. And then you begin to see the narrative shift in 1898 when McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt and Alfred Thayer Mahan began to say it's time to take manifest destiny abroad because we're finished here at home. The frontier has closed. But it doesn't work really until 1941, when Roosevelt marries the kind of hard, assertive, realist internationalism of 1898 with Wilson's idealist internationalism. And that's when you really get the liberal internationalist compact that survives essentially from Roosevelt through Barack Obama. So that then brings me to the present. And in many respects, Donald Trump is a throwback to pre-Pearl Harbor America. In fact, as you know, he deliberately reached back to the America First mantra of the interwar era. And for those of you unfamiliar with America First, this was a committee formed in 1940 to block Roosevelt from providing aid to the United Kingdom and other countries that were fighting Germany and Japan. And so from 1940 right through the attack on Pearl Harbor, the America First Committee is doing battle with Roosevelt over first cash and carry, providing assistance as long as countries brought their own ships, and then lend-lease. And the argument here was that this was a backdoor to war. But it's important to keep in mind that right up until Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt was part of the isolationist mainstream. He did not want to enter the war. He wanted to aid the United Kingdom so that the United States would not have to face Germany should the UK fall. So anyway, what I think is happening today is that there is a kind of swing back toward the isolationist impulse that has long been part of the American experience. And it's coming back because of overreach. It's coming back because of a pandemic that has led to an economic downturn similar to the 1930s. It's coming back because Americans do believe that expansion and commitments abroad have come at the expense of liberty and prosperity at home. And it's coming back because of nativism and populism, right? Trump is tapping into a nativist white supremacist narrative that was very much part of Americans' approach to the world until 1941, and actually after 1941, right up until the Civil Rights Movement. And I would keep in mind that some of the most draconian anti-immigrant legislation coincided with the strongest isolationist era, that is in the 1920s and the 1930s. So to finish, my view right now is that the task for the United States is to find a new middle ground between doing too much, which I think it has been doing, and doing too little, which is what it did during the pre-Pearl Harbor era, and to find that right balance, to step back but not step away. And I know it may sound a little bit odd that the United States could go back down the road of isolationism, but I would remind everyone that Obama was a retrenchment president, that Trump is a retrenchment president, that left and right George Soros and Charles Koch are again coming together to fund groups that call for pullback. That the cover of Foreign Affairs a couple issues ago was "Come Home America?" ? And prominent American strategists are calling for a pullback not just from the Middle East, but from Europe and Asia as well. So the punchline of my book is we can't let that kind of perilous retreat happen, but we must trim our foreign commitments. We must bring our foreign engagement back into line with means and purposes to avoid that perilous retreat. And I think that the multilateralism needs to come back. I think it would under Biden. The teamwork needs to come back, but we need to keep in mind that the isolationism and the unilateralism that have been very much part of American history are probably going to be part of our national conversation going forward. We need to channel those forces and not deny that they are now front and center. I will stop there.
Thank you, Charlie. I'm going to turn it over to David to respond to that and engage you. I'm very curious to see where you agree and where you differ.
Thanks very much, Leslie. It's great to be with you and Robin and Chatham House. And the wonders of the modern world mean that I can stay in touch with your publications and your outpouring of seminars, etc., even from 3,000 miles distance. And maybe I should say that I'm billed as President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, which indeed I am, but I'm speaking today in a personal capacity, perhaps with more link to some of my previous preoccupations and occupations than my current one, although I may try and bring in the humanitarian angle at some point in this discussion. I feel a bit like this is a tutorial in reverse, in that I'm the student and Charlie's the professor, but I'm getting the chance to interrogate him. So I'm going to milk that for the full. I think it's probably important, and I should say we've got an incredibly distinguished audience here. So Charlie and I are going to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes or so, and then there's a similar amount of time, I think I'm right in saying, for as many people as possible to make comments and ask questions. Charlie, I think it's important, first of all, to congratulate you on finishing the book. I mean, it's a hell of an enterprise, and you've produced a work of real scholarship and depth, and many congratulations on that. I think it's important for the audience, though, to know that you are very clear in the opening of the book that this is partly a work of history. It's partly an objective assessment of the currents of American history that have gone into what you call the isolationist impulse. But you're also making a normative argument that actually it would be better for America, query better for the world, if it, to quote you, if it learned that isolationism, quote, has much to teach. And so it's really, to state the obvious, I'm not going to be arguing with your history. You know far more about it than I do, but I think it's important to say both the, relatively speaking, ancient history of the foundation of the Republic in the 18th century, but also more recent history, speak directly to your thesis that the Trump administration is a symptom of deeper trends. It's not simply a bolt from the blue. I think I'm right in saying that in his last State of the Union address in the year 2000, President Clinton said that now that the business of building a post-war order has been completed, we can focus on the home front. George Bush famously ran in the summer of 2000 on the argument that Condi Rice wrote for him in Foreign Affairs that America wouldn't be the world's policeman. You quote Barack Obama saying that nation building has to start at home. So I'm not going to argue at all with your history lesson. What I'm interested in engaging in our 25 minutes or so is whether you're right in your normative prescription that isolationism would be a good teacher for future of foreign policy of the United States, conscious that when we're talking about the United States, we're talking about a country with greater global significance than many others. I mean, the most powerful democracy in the world, for all of the challenges to its democracy, which are real, its decisions have greater import than those of other countries. But I want to engage with that thesis, and the thread that will run through my 6 or 7 questions to you is whether or not you can sustain an argument for the brand of isolationist teaching that you advocate in a world of interdependence. And that's going to be the central thread in my questioning. Very conscious that in 1962, so quite a long time ago now, nearly 60 years ago, on Independence Day 1962, John Kennedy went to Philadelphia and gave a famous speech in which he said that the day of our independence is the time to declare our global interdependence. And so interdependence is not a new idea either, but I just want to explore whether or not it's possible to sustain the teachings of isolationism in a world of interdependence. And so I think the right place to start is a relatively simple question, because you address this glancingly in your book, but I think you should have the chance to say so. Just explain why you think interdependence, which I know you recognize, and you recognize this as a hyper-connected world. Why doesn't interdependence, global interdependence, why doesn't that vitiate the teachings of isolationism rather than make them relevant?
Well, just to clarify my argument, I'm not calling for a return to isolationism. In fact, I'm arguing against it. And when I say we need to learn lessons from isolationism, some of those lessons are good and some of those lessons are bad. We need to learn lessons from internationalism, some of which are good and some of which are bad. And part of what I'm trying to do here is to leaven the debate in this country, which tends to be kind of bimodal, with the liberal internationalists saying we need to stay out there and turn Afghanistan and Iraq into Ohio, and then the Polbrat crowd saying, let's get out, let's come home. And I'm trying to make an argument that there is a middle and responsible middle ground between those two alternatives. And I agree with you completely, David, that isolationism a la pre-Pearl Harbor is not an option. The world is too interdependent when it comes to global health, when it comes to humanitarian relief, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to nuclear proliferation. There's no way that the United States can retreat behind its large protective oceans and stick its head in the sand. It's precisely that outcome that I'm hoping to avoid. But I do think that we need to look back at the nation's history, look at the debate that's taking place in the country now, to say that there is this isolationist sentiment that's making a comeback. Trump, as you put it yourself, is a symptom and not a cause. And so my goal here is not to call for isolationism. It's to say there are lessons, good ones, about strategic detachment and not overreaching, which I think we need to draw on. There are lessons from the 20s and 30s about what happens when the United States cuts and runs, and we need to draw on that. But I do think that rather than just think about the United States as a post-1945 running the world country, we have to look at the broader swath, US running away from the world for much of its history, and try to find an amalgam of these two impulses. So in many respects, on the normative front, David, I don't think you and I disagree. We may have different emphases, but I completely agree with you that the United States needs to stay engaged, needs to be multilateral, and needs to engage in teamwork. The one caveat I would offer is that it's going to have to be more flexible. It's going to rely more on coalitions of the willing, on concerts, because just as a thought experiment, if you came down to Washington this afternoon and you and I got in an Uber and we took the post-World War II settlement down to Capitol Hill, the UN, the Bretton Woods system, the large architecture of post-war order, they would chase us off the grounds with a baseball bat. And that's because the Republican Party has essentially moved away from institutionalized multilateralism that requires treaties. So the country can stay engaged in the world, but it's going to be different than it used to be.
So just to be clear, I'm not prosecuting a case here. I'm here only to try and let you make your argument. And I also want to make clear that I think it's helpful for this discussion if we distinguish the history from the normative argument, from the sense of prediction. We'll come to the prediction point, because obviously your assessment of American politics is expert and real, and you'll have insights into the Biden administration. But I'm going to just try and focus on the normative question. I think it's worth, not just in the interest of trying to find disagreement for the sake of it, but to take seriously your case. Let's dig into what you actually want to happen, learning what you would consider the right lessons of isolationism. You say, quote, America must retrench from an excess of foreign commitments in the strategic periphery. And so I think it's right to let you explain what you mean by the strategic periphery. You've said you don't mean global health, to take that as an example, and I know you're not a supporter of America pulling out of the World Health Organization, so I'm not making anything like that. But the only example of the quote-unquote strategic periphery that I could find in the book, and I do confess to the undergraduate sin of reading the introduction and the conclusion rather more carefully than the intermediate parts in the time I've had.
It's unacceptable. You have to do your homework.
But usually one doesn't confess this as an undergraduate. But I could find you highlight the quote-unquote Middle East as strategic periphery, and I think it will be good to hear you say, A, why you think the Middle East, whether in respect of Syria or Yemen, why that is quote-unquote the strategic periphery of the United States, and secondly, whether there are other parts of the world that constitute quote-unquote strategic periphery. I did see the reference to Afghanistan, but it wasn't in that section of the book. So maybe you can, I want to give you the chance to say where you think the retreat should be from.
You know, I guess I fall into the camp of George Kennan, in the sense that I think the United States needs to focus on strong points, the parts of the world that are most important to geopolitical stability, and avoid the main mistake that it has made over the past 20 years, which in my mind is to engage in wars of choice in the strategic periphery that have essentially gone nowhere. And I think the US continues to spin its wheels in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. Libya was, in my mind, a major mistake. And in part, what I think is happening here, and maybe some of my colleagues from the US, I see Steve Wertheim is on the call, Jenny Lind, that the public reaction against these efforts to intervene in the Middle East, they're leading to a broader public backlash that, in my mind, could threaten our commitment to core areas. So I think we sort of need to go back to basics, that the guiding rule of thumb for American strategists should be the same as it was over the last 80 years, which is to prevent the domination of Eurasia by a hostile power. And Russia and China, I think, are still hostile powers. So I would not believe that it makes sense for the US to retreat from either Europe or Asia. In most other parts of the world, I do think the United States can do what it needs to do, largely through diplomacy and standoff military intervention as necessary to go after terrorist networks or to keep open the sea lanes of communication. But I do think it is time for the US to stop fighting these forever wars that produce very little of good and only erode internationalism among the American public.
Well, look, I'm certainly not going to argue with you about the strategic disaster in Iraq or the difficulties in Afghanistan. Just press the Afghan point for a minute. I've got to be slightly careful what I say, and then I'm sitting on a U.S. Institute of Peace study group on Afghanistan, and I don't want to preempt what that's going to say. But publicly available U.S. Defense Department and intelligence agency statements make clear that, in their judgment, the US cannot sustain its counterterrorism requirements without military presence in Afghanistan standing up the government. Just so we understand where you're coming from, is it your view that A, that they're wrong, or B, the price that is required to be paid for sustaining that presence is too high, and therefore there should be a disentanglement, to take your phrase, just to give that as an example of quote unquote strategic periphery? Can we pin down what your argument actually is?
Yeah, I mean, my main beef is with land wars in this part of the world. You know, I think it was kind of an act of folly to go into a country like Libya or Iraq, think that we could take down the government and build a functioning, stable democracy. So I'll leave it to the military experts to decide what sort of small footprint one would need in Afghanistan or in the UAE or in other parts of the region, so that we could use as necessary military force to go after terrorist networks. What I object to and what I think we need to end is these broader efforts to geopolitically and socially engineer these countries. I think the US had every right in the world to go into Afghanistan after 9/11, but then expanding that war to try to create a different kind of Afghanistan, going into Iraq, going into Libya. These have been very serious strategic mistakes that we and the world are paying for a very long time.
Let me just pick up, shift the focus, because you say that Asia isn't strategic periphery. Asia is part of the American equation of interest. I think it'd be good to hear, how has the emergence of a different kind of Chinese doctrine over the last decade affected your thinking? I mean, I appreciate you've been writing the book since you left the administration in 2017, but you've been thinking about these issues for 30 years. Many scholars of China and Chinese policy would say that since 2012, Xi Jinping has represented quite a shift, not just domestically, but internationally. Many would say that the doctrine of hide your strength and bide your time has been disposed of, that there is a new kind of external presence. Admittedly, there's a very stark division between those who want to see the Chinese doctrine in a Cold War lens. I'm not amongst that group. I don't think that's a very helpful way of thinking about it. But even those of us who don't want to look at this through a Cold War lens, or using a Cold War lens in which there's a zero-sum struggle for global domination, even if we don't find that particularly helpful, it is striking that there is a new, much more muscular Chinese presence, not just in its own region, but globally, including in global institutions. To what extent does this Chinese role in the world, with all the room that it offers for cooperation as well as for confrontation or for competition, to what extent does this impact your argument? How do you think your argument about the right course for America should take on board what's happening in China, or has it not affected your thinking on this?
No, I think that Chinese foreign policy has changed under Xi Jinping and become more aggressive, and that there is in the United States a bipartisan consensus that the US needs to get tougher with China, and that there are for now inescapable geopolitical, economic, human rights differences, conflicts of interest that are not going to go away anytime soon. So even if Biden is elected, I don't think you'll see a fundamentally different posture in East Asia. I think you'll see more policy rather than decision by tweet. I think you would see more engagement, a strategic dialogue with China. But I do think that we're headed into a period in which the continuing rise of China and its growing aspirations, particularly in the Asia Pacific, are going to run up against American naval primacy and the continuing presence of the US as a guarantor of South Korea, Taiwan, Japan, other countries in the region. To the degree that I think there is a development out there that could counter isolationist impulse that I'm talking about, the rise of China is it. Because if you go back to the 1940s and say, what was it that helped avert a return to isolationism after World War II? The answer is the Soviet threat. It concentrated the mind. And my guess is that the Chinese threat will play a similar role today. But I do think that the Chinese are good at what they're doing. They, in many respects, are following the American playbook. No alliances, commercial rather than geopolitical expansion, essentially in some ways unfurling their own Monroe Doctrine, which is we want to have naval primacy, strategic primacy in our neighborhood. This is going to lead to a classic power transition or hegemonic clash, and in many ways it is perhaps the biggest geopolitical challenge of the coming couple of decades.
I'm conscious of my time. I think I've got time for another question, and then there are questions either to me or to Charlie or just people to make statements, as long as they're not too long. As long as they're not sort of declaratory speeches of great length. Let me just finish on the following note, because you mentioned Vice President Biden and the prospects for his arrival in office. If you believe the polls, he's a long way ahead. And I wonder if your proposals, your prescription is radical enough for the moment, in the sense that when pushed, what you said is you want out of the Middle East wars, ground wars, but the other elements of the rules-based order that was being pursued, multilateral institutions, global health, presumably climate change would be a major area where you'd think global cooperation is a good thing. That's not an entanglement, that's a necessity. I'm sure you'd say that. I wonder if you're being, I wonder if there's not a critique that you need to be more bold in thinking about how the world is changing around the US, and that the isolation versus quote unquote entanglement, although that's a very, isolation and quote unquote entanglement versus engagement. Entanglement is a very pejorative word. And in asking you whether or not there doesn't need to be different thinking, for example, about the role of alliances and the way in which they would work, for example, about what Pascal Lamy calls a polylateral global system, not just a multilateral global system. If you read Bill Burns's article in Foreign Affairs, which I'm sure you have from a couple of months ago, he makes this rather interesting argument that there are three voices in Vice President Biden's head. There's a restorationist voice, or two voices, I beg your pardon. There's a restorationist voice, but there's also a reinvention voice that says simply trying to undo the withdrawals from Paris or the withdrawal from the Iran deal or the withdrawal from the WHO isn't enough. And that American progressives, American internationalists have got to reinvent rather more boldly the kind of agenda that they pursue, conscious of the challenges at home, but also conscious of the way the world has changed abroad. And I wonder to what extent you would like to reflect on Bill Burns's challenge for reinvention rather than simply a paler version of what came before.
Charlie, before you answer that, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to let you answer that, and then David, I'm going to take you and actually move you into panelist mode so that you are now going to have to answer the questions as well as Charlie. We don't want to lose the opportunity since we have you here. So Charlie, if you take that question, and then we're going to turn over to Stephen Wertheim next, who's had his hand up for quite a long time. And Stephen, I invite you to feel free to ask David as well as Charlie any question that you'd like. So Charlie, go ahead.
Yes, I invite all of you to go after David. Very, very aggressively. It's a great question, David. And it's something that I I spend a lot of time pondering about as I watch the campaign get into the final stretch. You know, I would agree with Bill Burns that restoration would be a mistake because the world has changed too much. The country has changed too much. There is no going back to the old liberal internationalist model, in part because there isn't support for that at home. As I mentioned, the kind of treaty-making zeal that Republicans and Democrats shared, that's gone. I think that it made sense to kind of try to run the world by bringing in the Atlantic democracies and the Japanese at a time when those democracies represented close to 80% of GDP. You can't do that anymore when China is about to have the largest economy in the world. So we really do have to have a broader rethink. And I'm just trying to bite off one piece of that. And then the other thing I would say is I do think that we need to have a national conversation about a reallocation of resources and priorities. We're learning that a virus poses a much greater threat to the American economy and the well-being of people than traditional military threats. We're very good at building F-35s and military spending, but we don't have a cybersecurity policy. And we don't know how to integrate cyber warfare into our thinking about security. I don't know where you are, David, on climate change, but it's here and it's coming on strong. You know, as someone who has young children, I think about where we go on vacation on the Delaware shore on the weekend. They're not going to be able to do that because those shorelines are going to be gone. So those kinds of issues, climate change, cybersecurity, pandemic, global health, they've been getting short shrift. And as part of this renewal rather than restoration, they need to get much more attention.
Okay, Stephen. We have Stephen, Jennifer Lind, Jeremy Greenstock, and several others, but we'll start with you, Stephen.
Thank you very much. A delight to see you, Charlie. And David, so in full disclosure, I'm a co-founder of the Quincy Institute, which Charlie alluded to as an organization with funding from Soros's and Koch's foundations. You know, if I heard correctly, Charlie suggested that my policy views consisted of calling from a retreat generally from global affairs. But in fact, if readers take a look at my essay in the issue of foreign affairs that he mentioned, I propose bold action, for example, to combat climate change and to deter China by promoting mutual denial operational concepts in East Asia. So I see myself as trying to right-size America's military footprint, and so is Charlie, I think, and that's good. But my main concern today is with the history itself. You know, for all of American history from 1776 or whenever you want to begin to the 1930s, basically nobody thought to describe the United States as isolationist or promoted something that they called isolationism. The very concept that Charlie's taking as his central analytical framework is a term that was used starting in the 1930s and 40s and used as an epithet almost exclusively. It's invoked against a disparate set of Americans who often supported vigorous trade, diplomacy, and cooperation, but for various reasons wanted to restrict US military commitments or engagements in some way. So if you take FDR, for example, he was clearly an internationalist, but he was famously stingy when it came to allowing immigration. Consider how he blocked Jews fleeing from Europe from coming into the United States. So these supposed components of isolationism are really separate and combined in different and surprising ways that the idea of isolationism obscures. And this issue, I think, comes to a head in our own moment with respect to Donald Trump, who, of course, claims he wants to end endless wars, but hasn't yet ended any. Instead, as he's always promised, he's ramped up military spending, engaged in maximum pressure campaigns, and so forth. This is so fundamentally different from the original America Firsters, whose whole argument was that the United States should defend the entire Western Hemisphere in 1940 and 41, but shouldn't go any further. They actually had a coherent conception of America's vital interests, like it or not, whereas Trump does not seem to have one. So I would just propose an alternative lesson we can learn from the same history, namely that we in the United States have come to misidentify internationalism with global military dominance, first and foremost. That's the problem today, and that's why we should, as Charlie suggests, recover insights from previous generations of Americans who were not isolationists, who actually considered themselves to be internationalists, precisely because they worried that the profligate use of force could undermine freedom and peace and instead produce endless war. Thanks.
Okay, before you respond to that, I'm going to get Jennifer Lind, and then I'm going to come to you first, David, and then you, Charlie. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Hi, thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be on this amazing panel here. And congratulations again to Charlie on this book that's yielding this amazing discussion. I wanted to go back to David's question, which I thought was really interesting about, so what does this framework tell us for which are the commitments that the United States should keep and which should they not keep? I mean, just to kind of preface this, I'm not clear how this framework would lead to the policy prescription that the United States should stay engaged in Europe, for example. I know that's a dangerous thing to say on this particular call, but again, if the
oh my God, you're an isolationist.
if the rising peer competitor is in Asia, again, what's the Canaanite argument that would say we should be in Europe? So my argument was to say you could have, related to this strategy of what we would call offshore balancing, which is indeed a strategy the US pursued in the past. You could have the case that said the US should come home from Asia, come home from Europe also, and keep up a vibrant diplomacy, vibrant trade, even remote military cooperation and so on. And if there was a threat of a regional hegemon in Asia, then the United States, together with its allies, would deal with that. So that's the argument for offshore balancing. But I don't know, with respect to when you spoke of the interwar years, you characterize that as offshore balancing failing, essentially. And I think that we could basically say the tragedy, as you put it, didn't it allow the Germans to get too powerful and to get too close to dominating Europe. And so that would be the argument that would say we shouldn't repeat that again, right? So contrary to what I just said, no, we can't. Still, I'm going to press you on Europe, but we shouldn't do an offshore balancing posture with respect to Asia, because there is an actual threat that we can imagine of regional hegemony there. If in that case, as we saw in the 1930s, you should stay more engaged than perhaps this offshore strategy might allow you to be. So I guess I'm really questioning or is this an offshore balancing approach? What does this recommend for Asia and then also for Europe? Thanks.
Okay, David, I want to get your reaction to the first question. Stephen, I clearly...
This is really Charlie's show, but let me be brief. First of all, in respect of Mr. Wertheim, I think it was Richard Holbrooke who talked about the militarization of diplomacy as the besetting sin of the United States in the 2000s. And that is completely to your point. Anyone who looks at the Defense Department budget, $750 billion, you can see that the different planks of foreign policy are not well balanced at the moment and have become more ill-balanced since Holbrooke said that. And so I think there's a lot in what you say. I think it's especially obvious now in parts of the world where we work. There's a crisis of diplomacy in most of the theaters where America is engaged, either militarily or diplomatically. Afghanistan would be the outlier, but that's being driven, I think, by a separate set of considerations, which we can return to. So I think there's a lot in what he says. I'll let Charlie argue about the history with him. To Jennifer Lind, here's the way I would come into this, and and we all use these questions just to mount our own hobby horses, but let me do that. Just give me 30 seconds to do it. I mean, the fact of the modern world, which I see every day in my work, but which is more widespread, is the rise of impunity. Impunity is the abuse of power by the powerful. It is power without responsibility. And the fact that chemical weapons are used in Syria, that coachloads of children are bombed in Yemen, is a breakdown of the rules-based international order. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding because people think the liberal international order, because it's got the word liberal in it, it means it's left-wing. It doesn't. I mean, the liberal element of the liberal international order was about establishing that rights of civilians as well as rights of states should be underpinned in international law. And the international part of it was that every country should be a part, and the order part of it was that there are institutions to defend those rights. What we're seeing today, not just in war zones, but more generally, is the rise of what I call the age of impunity. And I think in that context, it's absolutely essential for America to see its own interests as well as its own values in building countervailing power. And it does that through alliances, not just through its own strengths. And that is my explanation of why the transatlantic alliance is important, how if America wants to engage with China in any kind of systematic or serious way, it needs allies. And that's why personally I'm chafing a bit against being asked to choose which bits of isolationism do I like and which bits don't I like. I find my own thesis on this, be it to the extent that it can justify the label thesis, my own views on this, prompted by the question of how does one mount a significant and sustained attack on the abuse of power that is increasing feature, not just of international relations, but of domestic policy around the world. And that is obviously a big and different question, but I think it's one that is increasingly demanding of an answer. And given that you're all in London, I think it's a very pregnant question for a medium-sized country like the UK, which if it's not careful, will find itself as a sort of cork bobbing in the open sea, detached from the EU and viewed with some suspicion in the US.
The first thing I'd say is that this is the conversation that we need to have, in the sense that Jennifer's question, Stephen's question, David's response, this is all about the issue of kind of right-sizing American engagement in the world. And it's a conversation that I think Trump has helped instigate. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but I think we need to harvest from his presidency some important lessons. And one of those lessons for me is we need a national conversation about these issues. And then we can talk about, do we need a counterterrorism force in Afghanistan? Should we stay in Europe or should we not stay in Europe? We haven't really had this conversation in this country for a long time, and I think it's time to have it. On the specifics, I don't want to get into a kind of argument over lexicon and terminology, Stephen. To me, as I said at the beginning, isolationism is a good word to describe the United States until 1898, if you accept my definition, which is unwillingness to take on strategic commitments outside of North America. I accept that the US was internationalist if that means commercially engaged, culturally engaged, intervening when necessary to protect its traders. But that's a very different kind of internationalism that we have embraced since 1941. And in my mind, the debate between 1898 and 1941 was really about this question of, should we extend our strategic reach abroad? And the answer during the interwar period was no, not outside the Western Hemisphere. Coming to your question, Jennifer, a couple of things. One is that Russia is not a threatening country in the same way that China is, but I don't believe that this is a moment in which the United States can afford to leave Europe. The European experiment is stumbling. The United Kingdom has left that experiment. Populism is on the rise. We don't know where one of the great accomplishments of the 20th century, which is the integration of Europe, is going to go. It seems to me to be an unsafe bet to pull out and create a situation in which we test the durability of that project. And I share David's view that we need our allies and our like-minded countries to help build a new rules-based order and sustain that order. And my other comment would be, especially after spending a lot of time reading history of the interwar period and before, I'm not particularly confident, Jennifer, that once you go offshore, you can go back. That is to say, once you take a forward military presence out of Europe or out of Japan or out of South Korea, and then things start to heat up, I'm not sure the US is going to say, hey, we want to come back and put our head in the middle of this mess. And so I fear that once we're gone, we're gone. And then when to put it, when the bad stuff hits the fan, I'll avoid the use of words here, we're not going to show up for the party.
Okay, we'll come to Sir Jeremy, if you unmute.
Thanks, Leslie, and thanks to David and Charlie for an extremely interesting conversation. I want to make a comment again about isolationism, because I think there's a fundamental flaw in the whole strategy, whatever part it played in particular areas of US history, in that it does not serve the widespread of total US interests. What worries me about the current state of US attitudes to the outside world is that it's creating a vacuum. We've become used to the US presence in almost every international forum, every international problem or conflict or debate. The US has been there helping to solve the problem in one way or another. But the fear about overreach, Charlie, shouldn't mean that the United States does not reach. It's got to reach out. One of the reasons why the UK, alas, has decided to leave the EU is that it has failed to be relevant to the rest of the world, to reach out to the rest of the world, to play a global role. It's been too internally concerned. It's suffered from its own isolationism, and it hasn't served EU interests. It's the vacuum that the US might create through isolationism that will bring in China and Russia and Turkey and other players to take the role of the United States or fill the gap left by the United States in ways that are inimical to transatlantic interests. Is there not the need for a debate in the US about coming back into the sort of reach out of American territory that serves multilateralism, that doesn't regard the UN with such suspicion, that helps problems elsewhere, that forms alliances, that would be a much better servant of US interests than the Trump approach recently?
Okay, Robin, over to you.
Thanks very much, Leslie, and thanks, Charles and David. Really, really interesting conversation, and a very important one to have at the moment. It did strike me for a minute when you were describing, Charlie, what kind of isolationism was meant to be, which is avoid military entanglements, but engage in trade, engage globally, but avoid that military dimension. Seemed to be what China's been trying to do for quite a long period, is to thread that needle. It's losing some of that balance right now for multiple reasons, but interesting dynamic. That's just a quick comment. My question really is about American leadership. It strikes me that whenever one holds up the opposite of American isolationism, normally American analysts, policymakers don't talk about internationalism, they talk about American leadership. And when Europeans and others talk about avoiding American internationalism, they say we need American leadership. So I wanted you, if you could say something about leadership. Is that Is that a dangerous thing from your standpoint? Are you advocating internationalism without leadership? Or do you believe leadership, to the extent the US remains engaged in the Eurasian continent, or I think you've been saying in Asia part of it? And if it is about leadership, then I would think that things like bases become important because they're useful for hedging as much as they are for strengthening alliances, as David and I think Jeremy have both mentioned. So could you give me the leadership thing, and what does it take to be a leader?
Okay, let's go Charlie and then David.
To Sir Jeremy's question, I don't disagree with the normative case that you made for deep engagement. What I'm trying to speak to and what concerns me is that many Americans would take issue with what you described, in the sense that many Americans feel that globalization has worked to their disadvantage. If you look at public opinion polls today, 3/4 of the country wants out of the Middle East. A poll from the Center for American Progress showed that only 18% of the public believe in liberal internationalism, and a majority of the public either wants America first or disengagement. So there are funny things happening here in the American electorate that I think we need to take into consideration. I don't believe that these trends are the future, but I believe that Trump is tapping into them, and that's part of the reason he was elected. And to put it quite bluntly, were it not for the pandemic, I'd be worried that he would be reelected, because he is tapping into serious strains and concerns in the American electorate, who are kind of saying, what's in it for us? Why are we the ones that always have to send out the fire trucks? And so what I'm trying to do here, and I think that Stephen and Jennifer and other Americans on the call are also trying to do, is right size the nature of our international engagement in order to make it sustainable, in order to rebuild its domestic foundations at a time of diminishing domestic appetite and growing political polarization. And that sort of brings me also to your question, Robin, because yes, I do think that leadership is an important part of the equation here, in that, and this speaks to the question of the vacuum that Sir Jeremy mentioned, that there will be enormous vacuums if the United States isn't trying to build coalitions of the willing and provide public goods. We're already seeing that vacuum. It's a vacuum in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's a vacuum in Libya. There's a vacuum in Nagorno-Karabakh. And so in my mind, Trump he gets that there's an issue here domestically, but he has made a hash trying to right size American internationalism and American leadership. We need someone who understands that that right sizing has to take place, because it's necessary to providing the kind of leadership that the world needs.
So briefly, to try and leave room for some commentary or further comments. Jeremy, you're absolutely right that when the US withdraws, there's a vacuum. I mean, you can see that at the WHO. The rationale for pulling out was that there was too much Chinese influence. And of course, as a result of pulling out, there's more Chinese influence. I mean, it's simple, really. And you can see that in much more difficult theaters. Secondly, I'll only make 3 points. Secondly, Charlie is completely correct. As I tried to say at the beginning, the prediction business has to take account of deep skepticism that exists. And that seems to me to be founded on many sources. But the one above all is there are huge domestic problems in this country, really huge domestic problems. And they've not been addressed. I mean, there's not been an immigration bill since 1986. I mean, you've got to understand the degree of dysfunction that has been created. And never mind bridges that aren't being kept up to the mark, et cetera, et cetera. And never mind issues of diversity and race that have been ill-attended for a very long time. And I am very struck, as someone who's obviously not an American voter, not an American citizen, but someone who's living here at the moment, that these domestic problems are all consuming. And that explains a lot of why it's so hard to get an audience for international engagement. It's also why it's easy in that context to blame the UN rather than to blame yourself. And there's a lot of that going on at the moment. And I would say to Jeremy, don't underestimate the extent to which domestic problems are getting in the way. I say to people, of course, look, you can't take a holiday from history. You can't say we're going to spend 10 years sorting out our domestic problems and then we'll come back to sort out the world later. The world will have moved on, hence your vacuum point. Thirdly, I think your leadership point is really important. The truth about international leadership is it's actually pretty cheap until it becomes expensive. And it's cheap on foreign aid, it's cheap even on the bases business. You can make a case that it's actually cheaper to have the bases externally than internally. But when it becomes expensive, when the bullets start flying, that's when the trouble starts. And that is the strategic wonder or achievement of the post-war period, that the successive administrations bore the burdens. They paid any price and bore any burden when it was expensive as well as when it was cheap. And that explains a lot of post-war history. We're not even winning the argument at the moment that it's worth making the cheap investments rather than the expensive ones. And I think that shows you how far there is to go. I am, however, struck that the COVID pandemic provides a quite striking illustration of what happens when you don't even offer cheap leadership. And from my point of view, I've got to be slightly careful. I'm sitting also on the WHO's panel on pandemic preparedness. But I've said publicly before that the case of global health provides a really good test bed for trying to figure out what a modern international system should look like, relating international action to national action and local action. And I am struck by the common sense of a lot of Americans as they think about this. They can see that there isn't really a new normal until this is addressed beyond their own shores as well as within their own shores. I don't want to be grasping at straws, but I think that that speaks to your vacuum point as well as to the leadership question.
I'm just going to take one final question because Fernando has been waiting for quite a little while. Fernando, if you unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
I don't know what to say, though. I've been addressing the idea of expansionism and isolationism. And I suppose that Charlie's comment goes against someone like Robert Kagan, who in his book, Dangerous Nation, he essentially says that the US has always been expansionist and isolationism perhaps has wavered, but in the course of history, in the 19th century, there's always an expansionist tendency following the Monroe Doctrine and the seizure, for example, of half the Mexican territory. Once that expansionism stops, I suppose, then it takes off and goes to Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and beyond. So I'm not, I don't want to disagree, or I just simply want to, perhaps the whole idea of expansionism and isolationism, I suppose, has to take into account territory and territorial expansion, but that also changes depending on whether we're looking at the 19th century or the 20th century or now. That's all. It's simply a comment. Thank you.
Okay, we'll turn back to both of you for a final comment. That there's a lot in here, but I think why don't we come to you, David, and then to Charlie. I think, David, we're going to have you back to talk about global Britain. There are a lot of people kind of, you know, laying the foundation for another talk. But let's come back to you, David.
What is the question that I'm addressing?
Well, it's a question of territory. Or any final comments that you'd like to make?
Sorry?
The last comment that came on territory, but also if you'd like to make any, I don't know, final comments as we come to it.
My point would be that for those of us who are not Americans, we should think what we're bringing to the party. If you're a Brit or if you're a continental European thinking about the EU, or if you're from elsewhere in the world, what are we bringing to the international stage? And that seems to me the right kind of hedge. it hedges against the fact that America is an unpredictable, will become an unpredictable ally for the next 20 years. But it also hedges against the fact that it decides to attempt the kind of course correction that has been discussed today. And there's a danger in, I was a bit worried when I think Robin said at the beginning, everyone's focused on the American election. I mean, there's enough problems in Europe and I still consider Britain to be in Europe, there's enough problems for us to try and figure out on our own account and figure out what kind of posture and proposals we are bringing to a new American administration in the international domain. And so while I think it's true that American withdrawal can lead to vacuum with some dire results, and while I would argue that it's not enough to rely on American quote unquote leadership. American leadership has worked well when it has strong, effective, committed partners. And it worries me that there isn't that debate happening, because while it's possible to be bewitched by American democratic practice, it would be better to try and figure out what are we going to do and what are we going to bring to this polylateral global system. And so that would be my parting thought, that your question about what on earth global Britain is going to mean if it's not entrenched in alliances is a very pregnant question. But so there are also very serious questions about the future of EU foreign policy, never mind what's going to happen to democratic countries in other parts of the world that feel themselves facing a set of very, very tough external choices when they look at where their friends are going and where some of their rivals are positioning themselves. So that would be my rather sober closing thought.
Charlie, I'll turn it over to you. For those of you who haven't read Charlie's book, I'm sure you will, but you can also, he published was it last week, Charlie, your piece in The Atlantic, I think, which really flushes out the argument. It's well worth having a look at. But Charlie, your final thoughts on this?
Sure. You know, I think what I'll do is piggyback on what David just said, because this conversation about right sizing isn't just about us, it's also about you, in that I can't overstate that we're in a heap of trouble here at home. You know, David is not American, but he lives here and he sees what this country is going through. And under the best of circumstances, assuming Joe Biden wins, he's going to have his hands full getting the country up and running again, getting the pandemic under control, getting the economy going, trying to reach across the aisle, dealing with immigration, which, as David said, has basically been left on the back burner for decades. And so keeping the US engaged is not just our own conversation, it's also going to be about what the UK and the Europeans and other partners bring to the table. And I would remind everyone that this started well before Trump came in. Trump is not the first to say, we need our allies to do more. It was Obama who put the 2% spending target into NATO. Why did Obama do Libya but not Syria? Because in Libya, others stepped up to the plate and said, we're willing to pony up. In Syria, nobody was willing to pony up. And so if you want the US to be engaged and you want the US to carry water and you want the American people to say, yeah, we get it, we see why we need to stay engaged, it's going to require the help, the assistance, the readiness, the willingness of like-minded partners. I'm not in the UK, but my sense is that Brexit also has an isolationist, nativist twinge to it. And it is, to me, particularly troubling that the US and the UK together have stepped back from the world at this critical moment. We need to make sure that that trend gets reversed.
Well, that's quite a note to end on. This was a fascinating conversation, in part because it's so nuanced. I appreciated Stephen's comments that, is this really isolationism that the current president has been pursuing, given the increase in defense spending and everything else? But right-sizing the United States. There's a whole big question there about the UK. And to Charlie's comment, it's not clear that even if the UK needs to do that, that it wants to work with the United States. That it's going to take a little bit of love to make that seem appealing if there is a change of administration on January 20th. The big question for many of us, we shall see. David, thank you so much. I do hope that you will return to talk to us about Global Britain, and we'll get Charlie on the hot spot to respond to you. It's clearly a conversation that everybody wants to have with you. I know you're busy, but hopefully perhaps in January or February you'll come back and do that. Charlie, thank you. We will all read your book, and we'll certainly read the Atlantic article.
Leslie, thank you. Thank you for hosting. Thanks to all of you for participating, especially to David, who actually had to do a little homework to prepare for this. Thanks, David.
Good for me. It's good for me.
Thank so much. Thank you, Jenny.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Very good. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, David.